Yeah, hi there, morning everybody. So I'm Ben Burton. I work at York Council on our housing delivery programme. So our housing programme's been running since around 2017, but the kind of main part that we're talking about today is programme since 2019 when we moved to a Green Lib Dem political partnership, and that's really pushed forward our green agenda in the city. So it's a housing programme built out across land that we own ourselves and directly delivered by the council in partnership with a main contractor. And the main bit is that it's net zero carbon, including the heating and all energy use in the house as well. So not just the heating and the hot water, it's everything that the scheme uses. Yeah, if you can move on to the next slide, please, Kevin. So to start off, to give you an idea of how we've gone about achieving zero carbon in the homes. The idea is that each house itself will actually provide all of its energy needs. To do this, we use the Passive House methodology, and we're going to achieve Passive House certification on the sites. So as you can see here, the use of Passive House and the high insulation thermal performance that has allows the energy requirement for the home to be brought down to significantly by kind of over half. And that means that once we start, that gives us a better base to build on. And then the remaining energy is picked up via solar panels and the use of air source heat pump, which covers the hot water and heating for the property as well. Yeah, so that's kind of the idea there. If you move to the next slide, just to let you know, the heating requirement, we do use energy from the grid still, obviously they're not off grid, but the annual requirement will be picked up by the solar energy. So over winter, they'll probably be using more energy from the grid, but during the summer, they'll be carbon positive and returning energy to the grid at that point. To give you an overview of the scheme, or one of the schemes, for example, here, this is Burnhome, which is a scheme of 83 units. The Passive House approach leads to these quite terrace designs, because the idea of Passive House is better the thermal structure in terms of limiting the edges and how simple that form can be created, and the density of it makes Passive House more straightforward. So a key to achieving Passive House is trying to maximize those principles of achieving thermal gain from the sun, solar gain. So we orientate the site on a east-west orientation to get as much wind to sun as possible from the south, while also considering overshading in the summer to avoid overheating. What we also have is a very kind of holistic approach to placemaking. So you'll see that we have quite low car ownership. Ignore the car parks to the north, it's not ours. So we have a less than 1 car per unit, and this is in a suburban area. Some schemes have no parking at all, apart from for disability. And we focus our schemes around kind of a community focus as well, so to encourage walking and cycling. So lots of the streets are car free, and we have sustainable urban drainage to limit the amount of concrete we use, because we also focus on embodied carbon. So using timber frame, although that's come with its challenges this year with timber being significantly higher than it was previously. The final part in terms of energy is a focus on EV charging. So this will actually have a public electric vehicle charging hub to the north of the scheme that we'll pay for, and that will be publicly accessible and run by the council. And a focus on biodiversity as well, with the amount of tree planting we have around the site and trying to bring that back into the scheme. Next slide, please, Kevin. The first question I was asked to talk about was the best advice I could give for achieving this. And really, I think as a starting point for people, it's about getting the right people on board. For ourselves, we took a lot of time at the start of the programme to go out and because we have such a focus on bespoke design, we went down the approach of bringing in our own design team and doing it that way. So we did a 5-year architects framework that's brought in Michael Riches, who worked on Goldsmith Street down in Norwich, as our lead architect. And then they've brought in a number of talented firms alongside them, particularly with the Passive House. We've got Warm, who are based in Exeter, and Plymouth, and Leader, who are based in Leeds and also have a lot of Passive House and air source heat pump experience. One thing to consider for yourselves is you don't have to go down the design it your own route, there are lots of other options. I think that's a key one to consider what's right for yourselves. There are modular housing developers at the moment who do passive house. There are options to do joint ventures with kind of developers who have more experience in it. But the key thing is to make sure you have people who understand and know the route to it, so that you can de-risk it for contractors who probably do not understand the passive house element right now. Next slide, please. The next question was around how did we get people on board with the program that we're doing. So the credit for this one really goes to my manager at the time, Michael Jones, who is a little bit more of a romantic than me and taught me some stuff around narrative really here. So as we were setting up the program, he created this housing design manual that we created in partnership with lots of stakeholders. So planning, highways, the political parties in the council, other stakeholders in the city. And that really pulls together a lot of agreed standards for how the programme will work, and gets the buy-in of various different council teams, because it's often overcoming those issues in the council itself, in terms of the development, particularly in costs and highways and getting finance on board. So this housing design manual really sets out our goals as a programme. So delivering the housing we need, building healthy homes and neighbourhoods, which is around this. So a lot of the buy-ins around fuel poverty, rather than just the net zero itself. It's also about the wider benefits to the residents. So reducing fuel poverty, putting more money into people's pockets on a basis. So essentially we've been doing some work on bills, and even if you use it as the kind of worst case scenario, probably looking at about half of the running costs of a standard building regs house. So especially for our social rent tenants that move into these, that'll be a real benefit in terms of what they have to live off at the end of the month, especially with the price of gas at the moment. It'll be very favourable to move into these properties. And then wider ambitions around creating distinctive and beautiful places. So a lot about placemaking in addition, reducing the impact on the environment and supporting sustainable transport. So again, that was working with transport and highways to buy in the idea of having low parking, high levels of cycle provision and everything else that we provide on the site. So starting off by actually setting that narrative is a really important thing to do. Next slide, please. So the next one's around how we fund that, which is a challenging topic, as you'd expect, because there are a lot of costs in this, but it's very much achievable. So there is an increase on top of our standard costs, some of which I would add is hard to kind of break down, because the design manual also includes things for achieving higher levels of accessibility, building to house at larger housing sizes, to try and improve people's livelihoods. So it's difficult to identify. So in terms of the actual passive house itself, that looks to add between 5 to 10% in terms of the build costs directly onto the properties. The 5% could be achieved by doing a lot more of, in future sites, focusing on just getting that thermal envelope correct. So for example, on Burnholme, we've ended up doing a 3-storey dormer for our design purposes. But that's meant that we've needed lots more additional insulation to achieve that passive house certification. So really keep in mind the passive house design principles when you're designing, to limit the amount of costs that you add in, because you can reduce the amount of additional insulation you need just by designing well within the principles that they set out. And the other parts expensive are the solar panels have come down in cost a lot, but they still add between £3,000 to £5,000 per property. And the air source heat pump is an expensive piece of kit, and hopefully more will become available that work for a passive house. What we've found is that most of them are sized for properties with a much higher heat load, so we're quite limited in what's available to us to use. But yeah, that adds somewhere in the region of £10,000 per property once you add in the full supply and installation across the scheme, particularly on bigger houses. So that is a challenge for ourselves, and a consideration in future is, if you're wanting to go down this route, definitely focus on the fabric first approach, and then you can retrofit those items back in, because as mentioned in the opportunities, at least by doing the passive house, you'll reduce those retrofit costs in the future, because if you're not building to a high standard now, you will have to go back and do additional retrofit in the future. So there is potential for cost saving down the line by doing this work up front. The same for if you're fitting gas boilers at this point, they will have to be replaced in the future. So yeah, that's a key thought for us. And just to let you know, while there are these cost pressures, we are still managing to achieve a commercially viable scheme. We do 40% affordable, the mix of shared ownership and social rent. And then we have 60% market sale to offset that, and also to create mixed communities. We are looking to up the amount of affordable across schemes, but it's just about trying to get that right blend. One more on opportunities is sales value increases, and the piece of work we've been doing recently is looking at other people's environmentally friendly schemes in comparison to their local areas. And something we've seen is that you can really get higher values in areas that are perhaps lower income, because they set themselves apart in their exemplary nature as a high value, high sustainability scheme. So I think Situ in Leeds is a really good example of building an area where house prices are perhaps a little poorer, but they're achieving kind of city centre values by setting themselves apart as an exemplar environmental scheme. So it is a consideration that there are benefits, although does come with additional costs for the buyer within the market. Yeah, next slide, please. So we're doing a lot of work about how we can benefit the wider economy and the kind of co-benefits for skills in the city. We use the procurement to request from contractors additional training and apprenticeships in green skills. We also ask that they provide passive house training to a certain number of their supply chain and the subcontractors that come on, and ensure that they use SME subcontractors and train them up in the area in York specifically. On top of that, we've been doing work in partnership with York College, in partnership with our retrofit programme as well, to try and understand what skills are needed in the future, and to try and encourage people to uptake those skills and make sure that the college is providing the right training. So we're also asking contractors to provide time to the college as part of their offer to provide that training and put on courses. And we're particularly focusing at the moment on some of the retrofit where the real skill shortage seems to be in the city, particularly around things like external wall insulation, where there's a shortage of plasterers. There's actually very little uptake of plastering at York College, because children and young people don't want to move into that, because they don't see that being where they want to work, but actually that's where the requirement will be in the future. So really what we're trying to do is lean on the money that's coming in to the city from this construction work and try and focus that into expanding the wider skills base in partnership with other teams. Lastly, there's an opportunity to just use the weight of your programme to support SMEs, so letters of support for their supply chain, and also looking at whether you can specify any products that are coming through. We are finding that because it's quite specialist, there is a limited supply chain for certain things like passive house timber frame, and if that supplier falls to the side, then you can be left in a bit of a gap at the moment. So it's important that supply chain grows and that clients continue to support it by putting money into there, because without the supply chain and the money available to them, it's difficult for other people to uptake it. So it's kind of both parts need to move forward together. Next slide, please. And then finally, just in terms of materials we can share, happy to put forward through the group later the actual design manual, which you can search for online. If you search York Council design manual, you can download it online. Planning applications are available, and I can share the links to those, but they're called, the first two that are in procurement at the moment are Duncan Barracks and Burnholme, and they can be searched under those names. And the work we've done on sales values, I'd be happy to share with people who are interested in that, and I can put my contact details in the chat if people would like to contact me directly about that. And that covers everything in terms of the presentation, but excited to kind of discuss it more widely.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ben. And we have a good few questions. So I'm going to initially read them out, but I will try and invite people to ask them as well. So the first one from Ian, are you looking, and there were a couple of questions about the waste side of things. Are you looking at net zero for the waste stream as well? And is there any low-grade heat recovery from sewerage, wastewater, biodigestion of sewage?
Yeah, so not
waste to generate heat and power. So yeah, circular economy and recycling of waste.
Yeah, so we don't, not in terms of the actual housing itself, although I've seen some interesting.
Right, yeah, I can hear you now.
Great, you can hear me. Okay, good. Yes, so. Oh, I can hear myself back. Can you mute yourself, Kevin? There we go. Cheers. Nobody likes the sound of their own voice, do they? So in terms of that, we don't do any on-site, although there is some interesting work coming out of York University actually about converting household waste kind of in the property, particularly from kind of toilet waste into energy. So that's one to consider for the future. But in terms of the citywide one, it's not part of our housing programme, but York's taken part in a wider North Yorkshire initiative where we've created a waste to power centre that I've had the chance to visit. So it does a mixture of biogas from where it puts the waste into a digester. Essentially, it all goes there, separates out. Some of the waste goes into the digester and creates gas. The recycling is all collected up and taken off to be recycled, or hopefully recycled, knowing how the recycling system works. And finally, there is a large incinerator on site, and that's where all of the remaining waste that goes into black bin collection goes and is burnt, and then that is used for power in the region, and also they collect up the ash and prevent the pollutants entering the atmosphere through the way that they filter this stuff that comes off that process, and they take the ash away, and certain parts of it has to be disposed of safely, but certain bits can be reused in the economy. So that's the approach. So I'd be definitely happy to put people who are interested in touch with the team that develops it. If you can let me know who that is.
Brilliant, thanks Ben. And an associated question from George: what methodology did you use for the whole life carbon assessment of the development? What proxies did you use in your calculations? Yeah,
so interestingly, we haven't done the full life embodied carbon assessment. It's actually something that's ongoing at the moment. We're going to be using the RIBA assessment, which takes in all stages of the embodied carbon process. So some of that comes through our team at Turner & Townsend, who are our commercial cost consultants, and they will put alongside the cost of each item a carbon embodied carbon cost as well. We've actually used that in terms of our foundation design already to understand which foundation option was the least carbon intensive, and that actually let us kind of choose a midpoint between cost and carbon, and save kind of like 100,000 kilos of carbon on one site. So really interesting to see that in action actually, and we're hoping that once we've got the full embodied carbon assessment for the first site, because we use the same features across the future ones, we'll be able to finesse that and continue to do that as contractors come forward with proposals on the programme. Hope that covers that.
Brilliant, thank you. So Louise Marks Evans has a question: how are you supporting retrofit coordination and retrofit design support? Is there really because there really is a skill shortage. You've touched on the skill shortage already. Have you got any ideas about how you're going to solve that in York?
Yes, so I've only started to be slowly drawn into the world of retrofit. My colleague Adam Harper, who works on the retrofit programme, is very much the guru for us in the council, and really experienced in this. But essentially what we've done is there's kind of a mix in terms of the skills. As we mentioned before, we've started having discussions with the council's skills and employment team, as well as the retrofit team and York College, about how we can up that. So it's trying initially to understand what that skills shortage is, and we're trying to speak with subcontractors and understand that, although we are seeing that the external wall insulation initially is really going to be a problem in terms of the amount of rollout we need. We ourselves have got a stock of around 7,000 council houses, and we're looking at doing 50 to 100 in the first year of external wall insulation, but with the way that the cavity insulation in those will have started to fail over time, and it's probably more effective to put the external wall insulation on. That's a lot of requirement to get us to the point that we need to be over the next couple of decades, really, and being ideally faster, but it is a challenge for us. We've also managed to access some LGA grant funding. It was only about £40,000, but we've using that to upskill people directly. So we've paid for a number of people to go on retrofit coordinator training. We've paid for people to go on passive house training. We've paid for a number of tradespeople in the city to switch from being gas engineers to, it's kind of a conversion course from gas to air source heat pumps, and that kind of thing, so that those skills are being grown as well. So there is some opportunities to access grant directly to increase the amount of qualification in the city. And we've also done that to pay for certain members of the college to go on these training courses themselves, because a lot of them are from traditional skills background. So they, as much as they know that that's the direction that they want the college to go, they themselves often don't understand it. Same as most of us, it's all kind of a learning curve for myself as well. So it's really trying to get those skills into the kind of decision-making side and then create uptake. But I think it'll be difficult because we've got to have that conversation with the careers advisors and stuff in the city as well, because clearly there's an issue that people aren't being directed into the apprenticeships that are needed for the future if we've got a shortage of plasterers, and they're almost on the verge of having to consider whether they have a plastering course in York because there's so little uptake. So there needs to be a discussion with careers counsellors, schools and building colleges about encouraging students into those pathways, as well as actually increasing the availability of those pathways themselves. Let me just check if I've missed anything on that. Our private rental sector. So we've got a number of grant schemes we're applying for. And one of those is for the private rented sector. So we will provide our own, we will get that money in, and then we're putting on our own grant program through that people in the city can access. There's more information about that online. Or again, I can provide further details to that person. What I'll do is if we've got time, I'll put those contact details in the comments at the bottom. I think that's probably the best way. I'll try and get them sent out through the group.
Brilliant, thanks, Ben. And it's really interesting what you're saying about the ways in which you're working with the colleges, working with the careers advisors to in a very joined up approach. Do you actually have the how are you funding that training of people at the college, for example? Is that coming out of an education budget?
Yeah, so at the moment we were really lucky. We applied for the that grant from the local government association, which was £40,000, and we've been slowly utilising that. Interesting, we applied for it for a different purpose at the time, but because of COVID, it's been kind of repurposed into a number of different avenues, and this one's probably more useful than the one it was originally applied for, and they've been really helpful in being flexible in that. In future, it will have to come out of a skills budget, or we'll have to continue to lean on either our own programme or the benefits of public sector procurement and being able to ask for support from contractors, but they obviously can't run college courses, so we can ask them to put on training as part of their social value, but we can't ask them to run college courses. One of the issues we also find is that the college courses are quite structured and fixed, so the colleges themselves, it's easy to put on an evening class that's bespoke that people pay for, but the curriculum's quite set for certain college courses for apprenticeships, so it's actually hard for the college to say, oh, we'd like to also train passive house within that existing curriculum, because there's not time and there's not funding to do that. So they're kind of stuck to what the national curriculum for each building trade is, in a way.
Brilliant. I think that's one of the most inspiring things I'm bringing away from this talk. I'm going to go straight away and start to talk to the college and talk to. Well, in our case, we've got a county council, of course. You're a unitary, aren't you?
Yeah.
So it's a little bit more complicated. So David Somerville is bringing in the idea of community wealth building, so where other institutions apart from the council, the NHS and so on, all collaborate to be able to keep more of the spend within the council area. Are York adopting that kind of approach, and have you had some success in do you have a procurement policy, for example, that encourages you to spend locally and find?
Yeah, we do. I'd say so. We do typically do that. So we normally ask for a certain amount of subcontractors to come from, and supply the workforce on the site to come from within a certain postcodes in the city, because York, actually the York postcode covers all the way over to Scarborough, so we have to be quite selective which postcodes if we want them to be in the York area. But so we do that. One of the challenges with doing passive house and some of these ones we have at the moment, though, is that some of the specialisms, York already is not an area that has huge amounts of construction skills. Most of our labour comes from the northeast or Leeds and that kind of area, or a lot of our labour does. And also, so yeah, on top of that, kind of. Sorry, can you go for the question again? I've sidetracked myself on that one. Trying to think what it was.
Sorry, it was about community wealth building and collaborating with other institutions and keeping spend within the local area.
Yeah, so I think a good example is our use of the timber frame, and we wanted to use a timber frame. We wanted to de-risk the work for the contractor, so none of the large main contractors in the region have really done passive house at any big scale, and not since they kind of ended Code for Sustainable Homes, especially in kind of 2010 times. So those skills out there. So a lot of our work has been around trying to do the work for them and de-risk it and find ways that they just it takes the work away from them. And one of those was by using a timber frame provider who has done passive house on this scale and can guarantee the first air tightness test. And that led us to having to use a provider that's based in Ireland initially. And we've kind of given the option for people to go with others, but we worked specifically them on the design. And that means that a large portion of the work is already having to come from outside of the UK at that point. So that's where we're starting to speak to other people in the region and SMEs that are coming up in Yorkshire to try and understand how we can grow that. So there's actually a new passive house timber frame developer coming through in the region. And that's really good to see because it gives us more options in the future to keep things locally. So we try to support them as we go.
That links in with David's comment. Can York and other progressives collaborate to develop fully timber manufacturing capacity in Britain? So, maybe it's not just your area, but we all need to be collaborating on that. Yeah,
definitely. And there's a bit where we can do it through procurement, but sometimes it's kind of softer stuff where clients can provide letters of support and say that as the startups are coming up, we've done it before. Same with there's a hempcrete provider in Yorkshire. So hemp products quite good because they use faster growing kind of yield comes up, so it gives a good alternative to timber that's also stores carbon. But again, they're not in a position to do 100 homes at the moment, but we can say, York's interested in this, there's schemes coming up in the future, and we'd like to support that, and that helps them access grant funding. So there are other softer ways to support developers without having to actually put your money into it in a way as well.
Brilliant. I know it's not necessarily your area, but do you know if York are actually developing any local plan add-ons that are requiring developers to build to passive house standard?
Yeah, so definitely not passive house standard at this point, but we have a new one that's kind of a more typical council above building regs, and a reduction of carbon kind of from building regs by a certain percentage. I can't remember what it is off the top of my head, and that's about to be introduced. Something that is interesting is as we've started to do the passive house, and we work with a lot of partners in the city where we sell land to them as well and enable other developments. And because we've been doing the passive house, there has been a lot more interest in from other housing associations in the area when they're working with us about how they can do passive house. So a little bit to it is part of the aim of the programme is to try and encourage others to do it, and it's nice to see that that's happening. And we have considered where we're selling land for self-build, selling with a restriction to the buyers. So we do self-build programme where we sell the plots to buyers and they design and build their own home. And we've looking to sell future ones with a restriction or a reduction in price initially for those who are willing to build to passive house standard. And we've seen the self-builders who've come forward without that restriction are also just really keen to build to passive house themselves. So there's a desire from the buyers, not always from the developers at the moment, I think. Yeah.
Well, that's good to know, though, because the developers need to know that so they can actually meet the demand. We've obviously got a different situation in Lancaster in regard to land and house prices, but we do think, having run our upgrades to our local plan to address the climate emergency through viability studies, that we can require developers to build passive house standards. So obviously we've got to get that through the planning inspectorate, but I hope we're not the only ones who are doing that, because that is where we need to get to, isn't it? Or certainly the passive house equivalent standard. Okay, I think we're starting to run out of questions. So if anybody has got anything else to ask, do put it in the chat or the questions and answers. So David Somerville again, can you share a little of the Lowfield Green, your story from the City Council perspective? So this is, does the City Council do anything to promote co-housing, cooperative housing, community-led housing as well?
Yeah, so Lowfield Green is our, I'm just trying to work out where this comes from, but so Lowfield Green is our first site, which is actually prior to our Zero Carbon Homes programme, but it's actually still performs well. So we've gone for an above building regs design. We've added on EV charging ports to all of the properties, and the houses all achieve a EPC A, which is really good to see. So they are carbon, they perform better than a lot of homes will in the city, which is positive to see. And also across the site, so that's coming along, and we're seeing that develop quite nicely. So kind of half built out at this point. And alongside that, we actually have it's kind of a mixed use development that also includes self-build plots. There's a community housing group on there called Your Space who are looking to buy on there. And they are looking to build 19 homes, again, to a very high environmental standards, and that's under a community housing model on there, so mutual home ownership. And then finally, we're looking to do some older people's care on the site as well. So that's a real mixed use one. I think, it's a good scheme. It's interesting how the EPCs perform really well because of the gas combi boilers. And I think that's a challenge for ourselves in the future, that it's actually quite easy to achieve a very high EPC rating with a gas system. It's probably easier than using direct electric and passive house in a way. So, a consideration.
Wow, I didn't know that. Okay, thank you. Yes, so there's a request for you to put your links in the chat before we finish. So maybe we'll leave you 4 or 5 minutes to do that at the end, because then those will be preserved. You can send them to me anyway afterwards, so we can share them with people. Somebody's saying that why are developers still allowed to build houses that aren't zero carbon? But of course, that's a question beyond your and my head. Isn't it?
I did see a question and it's an interesting one on the on the accessibility to wood. This one was linked to bio pellets, tracks, power station stuff. But there is it's a kind of just a consideration for the future about that wood supply. It is an issue we've had this year, and then there are pressures from we even get pressures that knock on down the supply chain from things like forest fires in America. So they start buying more wood from Europe because they don't have their own wood timber resources. So the supply of materials and that green economy in the future, where we move away from building homes from concrete, which isn't realistic in the future. One thing we've noticed is that as the electricity becomes more carbon neutral itself, the grid, really, even if we just built our homes as direct electric and passive house, the real environmental cost is in the construction of the home over like a 50-year period, not actually the energy that's going to be used in the house. So that embodied carbon is a real focus, and it's kind of a challenge that's outside of our control in terms of supplying those materials as we move away from concrete to either timber, hemp, porotherm, clay blocks that they use in Exeter. There's a whole host of materials, but it just needs a lot of thought, really. And it's a concern, I guess, for us.
Yeah. Thank you. There's one more specific question on self-build. Does the local authority lay in services to each plot? Otherwise, it can be very, very expensive.
So we tried to on Lowfield, but the energy providers don't like to lay services that don't have an end point. They don't like to just leave a capped off service into a plot that doesn't have a meter or anything else. So there were some challenges there. So what we've ended up doing is bringing the services as close to the plot boundary as possible and creating private drainage connections or adopted drainage connections, like a manhole that will sit outside the plot boundary that they can access within about 5 to 10 meters of their front door. So we tried to bring down the cost that way and make it as easy as possible. But actually bringing the services onto site has proven to be impractical, really. So we do as much as we can, but we can't bring them to the property itself unless we go to the extent of doing like golden brick, where we build the first element of the home for them as well.
Thank you. And one more question about the performance gap, really, between the planned efficiency of passive houses and the actual efficiency, partly down to the way that the houses are actually used. So do you are you doing anything to make sure that people know how to use the building to get best possible energy performance out of it?
Yeah, so I guess one of the first kind of foregrounds to use, I think that's where in terms of the actual performance of the home and how it ends up being, I think that's where the passive house certification is really important as well. I see a lot of people going for passive house principles, but that means that their airtightness isn't actually assessed at the end and their performance isn't assessed, and that means that you're not actually getting what you've paid for. I've spoken to a number of developers who've gone down passive house principles, but when we've spoken to them, their airtightness performance varies hugely across properties. So I think that final end quality assessment with their certification is really important. In terms of usage, these schemes are kind of in the process of being constructed at the moment, but it's something we're giving a lot of thought to at the moment because we have issues with it with residents already. I had a good story from Goldsmith Street down in Norwich, where our architects working on one of them had gone back to site, and they said someone had asked what their second boiler was, and that was a mechanical ventilation unit, and they didn't realise what it was. So it's a kind of importance of tenant support, and also trying to simplify those uses as well. So we're going to aim to have a single thermostat in the property rather than access to all the controls. I mean, they will be able to get access to them when they need to, but initially it'll just be the thermostat on the wall. And then as much education as possible. So we're planning to put some time in to actually show individual tenants around the property and maybe come back to do that within a month, because when people are first moving in, they're just excited to get into their home, aren't they? So it's kind of recapping that with them when they're actually settled in and the problems have popped up and they've got a bit more time to think about it. So we'll have to think. We've got a lot of assessments planned to see how that actually works kind of a year after building them, but we'll be waiting to see how that actually pans out once they're built.
Yeah, well, certainly here at Lancaster Co-Housing, I've been living in a passive house now for many years. And as far as the thermostat's concerned, we just set it to the temperature we want and forget about it, because and if the house overheats, we open the windows because we've got a good breeze always going by the. So that, they don't have to be so difficult. It's the the ventilation system needing regular changes of filters that is a bit more of a pain to remember. Yeah, no, Louise, I'm not in the passive house at the moment, so I wouldn't be wearing my jacket otherwise. Yeah, that certainly we benefit from being a co-housing scheme and having really good connections with each other. So we have a WhatsApp group and things like that. So, you know, I think the more people live in passive houses, I think the more it's really useful if they have ways to communicate, to share tips and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry I couldn't bring anybody in to actually contribute. I haven't quite got the hang of the hopping technology here. One more final question, and then we'll finish. Does the building control include moisture and CO2 monitoring for the system? The controls that are put into the houses.
I've finally been found out. I'd have to ask that one to my M&E engineer. So the answer to that, what we are doing is we are interestingly putting in some sensors. We're planning to put some sensors into the passive house homes, but also into existing properties, council estate and the low field ones, and putting them into properties before and after retrofit. And those sensors are a mix of moisture, CO2, heat, temperature, and activity sensors. And the idea is to try and monitor the performance of all of our properties. It's something that the IT teams come up with. So they've accessed some of these sensors, and that should give us some comparative information across our stock. Particularly interesting to see the homes kind of before and after fitting external wall insulation to see what difference that makes to tenants as well. So so I don't know whether our ones operate in that way. I'll ask the question.
Ben, thank you so much. I think this is one of the most informative sessions that I've ever participated in. So I'm sure, you know, I will certainly be sending this link round to our housing department afterwards, and I imagine it's going to get viewed a lot. So thank you so much for coming and sharing all of that incredible work that you're doing. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you. Cheers.
Okay. Goodbye, everyone. See you in the networking, maybe.
Yes.
Thanks, Ben.
Thanks, everybody. Bye now.